Hello, Sarah of SDK Handmade here, and today I want to share with you how to do an applied ribbing. Let's go. Applied ribbing is one of those super cool techniques that once you learn it, it is easy to apply in all sorts of fun situations. But the very first time I tried to do applied ribbing, reading the instructions, I just could not visualize it. So I think a video tutorial is perfect for this technique. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about adding applied ribbing to your fabric, because in my personal opinion, there's an easy way to do it and there's a hard way to do it. So I have two finished edges on my crochet fabric here that have the V's that you would normally work into. So the top of my fabric. And then I always work into the back bump of my chain. I'll attach a video on how to do that. I'll link it in the description below so that if it's something you want to try, it's a handy technique because it makes adding applied ribbing to the bottom of a garment super easy. But also it just gives this really nice finished edge to the bottom that matches the top. So it's one of my go-to techniques for every project I do. I always do work into the back bump of my chain. So I have two easy sides, my top and my bottom, to add my applied ribbing to, because I have the V's just like you would be working into adding any other stitch. But if you work, let's imagine that my teeny tiny swatch here is a cardigan, right? You've either worked from the top of the cardigan down or the bottom of the cardigan up, generally speaking, a lot of times. So you end up with your edges along the neckline of the cardigan. And that may be one of the places where you want to add an applied ribbing edge to give it a ribbing around the neckline. And you can see that this is just the end of my stitches, so there are no V's to work into. You can just work the applied ribbing right along there. Totally doable. However, I find it much easier to add my applied ribbing to the tops of stitches. So what I would recommend is that you add a single crochet border with the right side facing. Just add a single crochet border along the side of your stitches, and that way you can really easily work back into those stitches when you do the applied ribbing. The other thing is, and I'll link my video below about adding a single crochet border around something, but sometimes working the exact correct number of stitches doesn't look quite right. And it is so much easier, especially if you're working around something big like a neckline or a hem of a cardigan. It is so much easier to work the row of single crochets around, look at that and say, I need to frog back, it's not laying quite right, than to work applied ribbing. Applied ribbing is a lot more time consuming and a lot more work. So I highly, highly recommend, if you want to add applied ribbing to an edge that isn't the bottom or the top of your work, to go ahead and add a single crochet border before you start your applied ribbing. So to keep it simple, I'm just going to add my applied ribbing to the top of just this little swatch that I have here. No matter where you're adding your applied ribbing, as long as it's a flat edge, it's going to be exactly the same as this. So to do this, all you need is a piece of crocheted fabric. If you're just practicing, work yourself up some double crochets like I did here. I actually think mine is a mix of a double and half double, but it doesn't matter. You just need this edge, and I would say give yourself a couple inches so that you have something to hold on to here. And then you need yarn. I'm going to use a different yarn from my swatch just because it's easier then to see my stitches, and an appropriate crochet hook. You can, if you're practicing, do it in whatever size yarn and hook you're really comfortable with. When you apply your ribbing, you are going to be working perpendicular to your piece of fabric. So keep that in mind if you're planning to add an applied ribbing to a project. It's going to be worked perpendicular to the edge that you're working on. So what you need to do is take your yarn and you're going to join at wherever you want to start your ribbing. So if you're doing this with a pattern, read your pattern carefully about where to join your yarn. If you're just practicing and playing, no rules, whatever you want. Join it in the middle if that's easier. It's all about the practice. So I'm going to attach my yarn in my first stitch here, just by my choice. And then you're going to chain, again, however many you want, or however many your pattern says. So let's chain 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'd like to pause here to say there are lots and lots and lots of ribbings you can do. I am going to go ahead and do just a single crochet in the back loop for my ribbing. Read your pattern. I'll link other videos I have about ribbing below. But whatever type of ribbing you're doing, it's going to start with this chain. Now, since I'm doing single crochet, I said I chained 7. I'm going to work into the second chain from my hook, which means I'm going to have 6 single crochets. So I'm working into the back bump and I'm going to work 6 single crochets back down my chain. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Starting this off is a little finicky. It's not you, it's just the way it is. So don't feel like this is weird and it looks weird. It is and it does, but it's fine. So what you're going to do is once you've attached to the side, and now you've worked back a row and you need to attach that row to your work. So what you're going to do is you're going to slip stitch into your next stitch of your work. So to attach that row to my fabric, I'm going to slip stitch and then I'm going to work another row. And so I need to slip stitch again to attach my next row to my fabric. So you're going to work your ribbing back. You're going to slip stitch in the next stitch and the next stitch, and then you're going to turn your work. Now, it can be a little hard to find where you're going to work into your next stitch to start your ribbing back. If you are finding that you end up with too few or too many stitches in your applied ribbing, it might be that either you're skipping too many stitches up here or you're working your slip stitches, and that's how you're ending up with more and more of your applied ribbing. So I slip stitched 2. We're going to skip those. So 1, 2, and this is my first stitch that I'm going to work into. I'm doing single crochet back loop, so I'm going to go into the back loop and I'm going to single crochet 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, this is just a little trick for back loop. Again, do what your pattern tells you to. But I find that when I'm working in the back loop, if I work this last stitch in the back loop, it kind of leaves a bit of a gapy hole there. So I always just, with my final stitch, I single crochet. So that's personal preference. Again, just a little tip. If you don't prefer that, you don't have to do it. It's totally fine. Totally up to you. That's one of the great things about crochet, right? You do what you think looks best. So to start my next row, I'm going to chain 1 and turn. Again, like I said before, I'm going to single crochet in my first stitch just as a preference. And then I'm going to work in the back loop for 5 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now I will say, because of the way this last stitch is worked and how the yarn wraps and everything, it can be a little tighter and a little harder to find. But you want to work that to make sure that you're keeping the same number of stitches in your ribbing, so your ribbing doesn't start to fold in on itself or weave back out on itself. If you find that your applied ribbing is kind of waving back and forth, it might be because on the way in, you're skipping that final stitch, and on the way out, you're adding a stitch by going into one of your slip stitches. So just all things to be aware of. Now, we've worked another row of height going this direction, so we need to attach that to our fabric with a slip stitch, and then another slip stitch for our next row, and we're going to turn, work back in the other direction, and you just keep going in that same pattern until you have all of the applied ribbing that you'd like. One more little quick tip about adding an applied ribbing. If the purpose of your applied ribbing is to cinch in the edge of your fabric, so like on the cuff of a cardigan or a sweater, you may want to go down a 0.5 millimeter in hook size to a full millimeter in hook size. Ribbings tend to be, depending on what they are, stretchy. And so they're the perfect thing to shrink in a little bit to help give a little fitting around those kinds of places. And that is how you do applied ribbing. It is such a fun technique, and if you are a ribbing lover, it can allow you to add ribbing to all sorts of patterns, even if they don't necessarily call for it. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. It is always my goal to help you grow confidently in your craft. I would love it if you would like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on notifications. Check out the links in the description below for all the things, and happy crafting!